Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
It was one of those bright spring afternoons when St. Mary Mead appeared almost impossibly peaceful. The hedgerows shimmered with fresh blossoms, bees drifted lazily between the flowers in the church garden, and the ancient stone cottages glowed warmly beneath the gentle sunlight. Nothing about the village suggested that before the day ended, it would become the center of a mystery whispered about for years afterward. The annual parish fundraising tea had drawn nearly every resident to the church hall. Long tables covered with white linen displayed homemade cakes, delicate sandwiches, jars of preserves, and polished silver teapots that reflected the cheerful bustle of the gathering. Elderly ladies compared recipes with complete seriousness. Children darted between the chairs in pursuit of one another, and the village choir attempted to sing while being repeatedly distracted by conversations and laughter. The Reverend Stephen Mallory, the village vicar, moved happily among his guests, thanking volunteers and ensuring that every newcomer received a warm welcome. He possessed the rare gift of making even complete strangers feel as though they had belonged in St. Mary Mead all their lives. His kindness had earned him genuine affection throughout the parish, though Miss Marple often reflected that people who spent their lives listening to others' troubles sometimes learned more than was altogether safe. Miss Marple herself occupied a quiet seat near one of the tall windows, knitting with calm concentration while appearing almost entirely absorbed in pale green wool. Those who knew her understood that her knitting rarely prevented her from observing everything taking place around her. She watched as Mrs. Finch poured tea into a line of waiting cups with remarkable efficiency. Beside her, young Emily Carter carefully arranged slices of lemon upon small china plates. The church hall hummed with comfortable familiarity, yet one small detail quietly caught Miss Marple's attention. The Reverend Mallory declined the first cup of tea offered to him. "I'll have another in a moment," he said pleasantly. "I should first greet the Thompsons. They've only just arrived." Mrs. Finch smiled. "Of course, Reverend." It seemed an entirely ordinary exchange. Miss Marple nevertheless remembered it. A few minutes later the vicar returned, laughing at some cheerful remark made by Colonel Bantry. Mrs. Finch, now occupied elsewhere, asked Miss Emily Carter to prepare another cup instead. Emily happily obliged. The Reverend accepted it with thanks. Nearby, Mrs. Lydia Harper remarked to her companion that the church roses had never looked finer. Dr. Haydock discussed village improvements with the chairman of the parish council. The afternoon drifted onward without the slightest hint of danger. Only one person appeared unusually restless. Mr. Edwin Fletcher, the church treasurer, repeatedly checked his pocket watch and glanced toward the entrance as though expecting someone who never arrived. Whenever conversation drew him in, his attention wandered again almost immediately. Miss Marple noticed the habit but assigned no importance to it. People awaited visitors for countless innocent reasons. The choir concluded its final hymn just as refreshments reached their busiest moment. Cups were refilled, cakes disappeared rapidly, and cheerful conversation echoed through every corner of the hall. Then the vicar paused. He had been speaking with Mrs. Harper when his sentence stopped abruptly. His teacup slipped from his fingers. It struck the polished wooden floor with a sharp crack before shattering into dozens of delicate fragments. For an instant no one moved. The Reverend staggered backward, one hand pressed against the edge of the table. His face had become strangely pale. Dr. Haydock reached him just before he collapsed. "Give him room." The cheerful gathering dissolved instantly into confusion. Chairs scraped across the floor. Guests hurried forward, only to be pushed gently back by the doctor. Someone opened the windows. Another ran for fresh water. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the unconscious vicar, feeling for his pulse with growing concern. After several tense moments he looked up. "He is alive." A collective breath seemed to pass through the room, but critically ill. The doctor lifted the fallen teacup carefully, examining the few remaining drops that still clung to the broken porcelain. His expression changed. "What is it?" Colonel Bantry asked. Dr. Haydock answered, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "I believe this tea has been poisoned." The words spread through the church hall with astonishing speed. Within seconds, every conversation ceased. No one reached for another cup. Several guests instinctively placed theirs upon the tables. Mrs. Finch stared in disbelief at the row of untouched teapots. "That can't be possible." Dr. Haydock remained calm. "No one is to drink anything further." The village constable, who happened to be attending the gathering with his wife, immediately secured the refreshments, while another volunteer hurried to telephone the county police. Miss Marple slowly laid her knitting upon her lap. She did not approach the unconscious vicar. She did not examine the teacups. Instead, her eyes rested upon the serving table where the refreshments had been arranged. Most people were looking at the poisoned cup. Miss Marple was looking at the empty space beside it. There should have been 6 cups waiting on the silver tray. There were only 5. She said nothing, not yet, because in her long experience, the smallest absence often proved far more revealing than the largest discovery. By the time Inspector Julian Mercer arrived from the county headquarters, the church hall had become unnaturally quiet. The cheerful decorations remained in place, half-eaten cakes still rested upon serving plates, and untouched teapots stood where they had been abandoned. Yet the room no longer resembled the scene of a parish celebration. It had become a crime scene. Dr. Haydock had already arranged for the Reverend Mallory to be taken to the county hospital. Before leaving, he quietly informed the inspector that the vicar remained alive but unconscious. "The poison acted quickly," the doctor explained. "Had he received treatment even a few minutes later, I doubt he would have survived." Inspector Mercer nodded. "So whoever administered it knew precisely what they were doing." "Either that," replied the doctor, "or they were very fortunate." The inspector began questioning everyone who had been near the refreshment table. Mrs. Finch explained that she had poured the first cup for the vicar, but he had declined it while greeting late arrivals. She had then returned to serving other guests, leaving the tray unattended for only a short time, before asking Emily Carter to prepare another cup. Emily appeared deeply shaken. "I simply picked up a clean cup and poured tea from the silver pot." "Did anyone touch the tray while you were away?" the inspector asked. "I honestly don't know." Several guests admitted passing the refreshment table during those few minutes, but none recalled seeing anything unusual. Colonel Bantry insisted he had been discussing gardening with the chairman of the parish council. Mrs. Harper remembered borrowing extra sugar. Edwin Fletcher admitted collecting another biscuit before returning to his conversation. Every account sounded ordinary, yet together they created a troubling problem. Almost anyone present had enjoyed an opportunity. Meanwhile, Miss Marple remained quietly seated near the window until the inspector approached her. "I understand you observed the gathering from the beginning." "I believe so." "Did anything strike you as unusual?" She considered the question carefully. "Only something rather small." Inspector Mercer smiled patiently. "I've learned that small things often become large ones." The Reverend declined his first cup. "Yes, and when the second cup was prepared, 1 cup had disappeared from the tray." The inspector looked toward the serving table. "You are certain?" "I counted them while waiting for my own tea." "Could someone simply have used it?" "Perhaps." She paused. "Though I never saw anyone drinking from it." The inspector examined the remaining china. 5 clean cups rested neatly beside the teapot. Several used cups had already been collected from nearby tables, but none matched Miss Marple's observation precisely. He instructed a constable to search the entire hall. After nearly 20 minutes, the missing cup was found behind a large flower arrangement near the stage. It contained only a few drops of cold tea. "No fingerprints worth mentioning," the constable reported. Inspector Mercer frowned thoughtfully. Miss Marple studied the recovered cup without touching it. "It seems an odd place to leave perfectly good china, unless someone wished it to remain unnoticed," the inspector replied. She nodded gently. "People who hide things are often less interesting than the reason they choose a particular hiding place." As the officers continued their search, village gossip quietly began to spread beyond the church hall. By evening, nearly every resident of St. Mary Mead had formed a theory. Some believed the poison had been intended for the vicar personally. Others insisted another guest had been the true target. Miss Marple listened to each opinion with polite interest, but privately she found herself returning to the same quiet question. If someone had planned the crime so carefully, why leave behind one poisoned cup and take such trouble to hide another? The following morning brought little comfort to St. Mary Mead. News arrived from the county hospital that the Reverend Mallory had survived the night but remained unconscious. Dr. Haydock was cautiously optimistic, though he warned that recovery would be slow. The announcement relieved the village, yet it also intensified the mystery. If the vicar regained consciousness, he might remember something vital. Until then, the investigation would depend upon observation rather than testimony. Inspector Mercer returned to the church hall before the doors were reopened. Every table remained exactly where it had stood during the fund-raising tea. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating a room that looked peaceful once again. It was difficult to imagine that only a day earlier it had been filled with panic. The inspector ordered each volunteer to demonstrate precisely how refreshments had been served. Mrs. Finch poured tea from the large silver pot, while Emily Carter arranged cups upon the tray. "This is where the Reverend's first cup stood," Mrs. Finch explained, "and after he refused it," asked the inspector. "I placed it back here." Emily nodded. "I remember because I had to move the sugar bowl to make room." Inspector Mercer carefully watched their movements. Everything appeared perfectly natural. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood quietly near the stage where the missing cup had been discovered. She looked not at the cup itself, but at the flower arrangement that had concealed it. The display consisted of fresh lilies, white roses, and tall branches of greenery arranged in an unusually heavy brass vase. She gently touched the edge of the stand supporting it. "How curious," she murmured. "What is?" the inspector asked. "This stand has recently been moved." He examined the polished wooden floor. Sure enough, faint scratches extended several inches beyond the vase. It wasn't standing here originally. No. Who moved it? No one seemed able to answer. The church caretaker eventually remembered rearranging the flowers shortly before guests arrived. "But I certainly didn't move them afterward." The inspector made another careful note. Someone had shifted the heavy arrangement after the poisoning, almost certainly to hide the missing cup. That afternoon, Inspector Mercer questioned Edwin Fletcher once more. The church treasurer remained calm, though noticeably tired. "You appeared rather anxious during the tea," the inspector observed. "I was expecting an accountant from the neighboring village. Did he arrive?" "No." "Were you worried?" "Only about the parish accounts." The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, the inspector sensed that Fletcher was withholding something. Before leaving, he asked one final question. "Did the Reverend know about your concerns?" Fletcher hesitated. "Yes." "Did you argue?" "Certainly not." "But you discussed finances." "We did." After Fletcher departed, Miss Marple reflected quietly upon the exchange. People who concealed unpleasant truths often chose answers that were technically accurate while avoiding the real issue altogether. Later that evening, Mrs. Harper visited Miss Marple for tea. "I remembered something rather silly," she admitted. "There is no such thing as a silly memory." Mrs. Harper smiled. "Just before the Reverend became ill, I saw Emily Carter wiping the handle of the silver teapot with her handkerchief." Miss Marple looked up. "Did she explain why?" "No, I assumed she'd spilled tea." "And did she?" "I don't know." The observation seemed insignificant. Yet Miss Marple had learned that people rarely polished clean objects without reason. As twilight settled over the village, Inspector Mercer received the laboratory report. The poison had not been mixed into the teapot itself. It had been present only in the Reverend's cup. Whoever committed the crime had added the poison after the tea had been poured, requiring both confidence and a brief moment alone with the cup. The list of possible suspects had narrowed considerably, but one troubling question remained unanswered. If the murderer had acted so carefully, why risk returning to hide the second cup instead of simply leaving it where it had been? That unnecessary decision suggested panic rather than planning, and panic, Miss Marple believed, often revealed far more about a person's character than even the most carefully prepared crime. By the third day, the attempted poisoning had become the only subject anyone in St. Mary Mead wished to discuss. Conversations that ordinarily revolved around gardens, weather, and church socials now centered upon motives, opportunities, and whispered suspicions. Nearly every villager possessed a different theory, and each was defended with complete confidence, despite the absence of real evidence. Inspector Mercer ignored the speculation and concentrated instead upon establishing a precise timeline. He returned to the church hall, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, who had received encouraging news from the hospital. The Reverend regained consciousness briefly this morning, the doctor said. Was he able to speak? Only a few words. What did he say? He asked whether everyone else was safe. The inspector smiled faintly. Entirely in character, quite. Did he remember drinking the poison tea? Dr. Haydock shook his head. Not yet. The investigation therefore continued without the victim's account. Meanwhile, Miss Marple visited the vicarage under the pretense of watering the Reverend's neglected roses. The small house remained quiet, with only the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, attending to daily tasks. I still cannot believe anyone would wish him harm, Mrs. Ellis said sadly. He was a kind man. Kindness sometimes uncovers uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Ellis looked puzzled. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled gently. The clergy often hear confessions of one sort or another. The housekeeper hesitated before replying. There was something unusual last week. Oh, a gentleman visited after evening prayers. Did you recognize him? No. He insisted upon speaking privately with the Reverend. For how long? Almost an hour. Did they argue? I couldn't hear clearly. But afterward the Reverend seemed troubled. Mrs. Ellis walked to a writing desk and opened one of its drawers. I nearly forgot. She removed a folded piece of paper. He was reading this after the visitor left. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The paper contained only a single handwritten sentence. The truth becomes dangerous when spoken aloud. There was no signature, no date, nothing to identify its author. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Ellis and immediately delivered the note to Inspector Mercer. He examined it thoughtfully. A threat, perhaps, or a warning. Later that afternoon, the inspector interviewed Emily Carter once again. She appeared calmer than before, but still visibly distressed. Mrs. Harper tells me you wiped the teapot handle with your handkerchief. Emily looked surprised. I did. Why, there was jam on it. Jam. One of the children bumped into the table while eating a scone. Inspector Mercer studied the teapot. A faint, sticky mark remained near the lid. Her explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. Even so, he asked another question. Did anyone touch the Reverend's cup after you poured the tea? Emily thought carefully. I remember setting it on the tray, and then I turned to fetch lemon slices. For how long? Only a few seconds. The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. A few seconds, long enough. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, considering everything she had learned. The missing cup, the moved flower arrangement, the anonymous warning, and the brief, unattended moment all seemed connected. Yet, something essential remained absent. Then she remembered an observation that had seemed entirely trivial at the time. When the Reverend declined his first cup, Mrs. Finch had placed it back on the tray without emptying it. That meant 2 prepared cups had briefly existed together. One accepted, one refused. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully across the fading garden. If someone intended to poison the vicar before he returned for his second cup, they would first need to know exactly which cup he would eventually choose. That required more than opportunity. It required certainty, and certainty, she reflected, usually belonged only to someone who had been standing close enough to watch every movement from the very beginning. The realization that 2 prepared cups had briefly rested on the serving tray changed the direction of the investigation. Until then, Inspector Mercer had assumed the poison must have been added after the Reverend accepted his tea. Miss Marple's observation suggested another possibility. If the murderer had been watching closely enough, the poison could have been introduced during the brief confusion between the first and second cups. The inspector arranged for another reconstruction, this time asking every volunteer to repeat their exact movements, second by second. Mrs. Finch poured the first cup and placed it before the Reverend. He smiled apologetically and stepped away to greet the Thompsons. Without thinking, Mrs. Finch returned the untouched cup to the tray. Emily Carter then busied herself arranging lemon slices while several guests approached the refreshment table. Inspector Mercer stopped the demonstration. Who stood nearest the tray at this moment? Colonel Bantry remembered reaching for another biscuit. Mrs. Harper admitted adding milk to her own tea. Edwin Fletcher recalled borrowing a spoon. 3 different people had been within arm's reach, yet none admitted touching the Reverend's cup. Meanwhile, Miss Marple quietly examined the church hall itself, rather than the reenactment. Her attention settled upon the long mirror hanging opposite the refreshment table. It had decorated the hall for decades, and few people gave it a second glance. She walked toward it slowly. From its polished surface, she could clearly see the serving table reflected behind her. More importantly, anyone standing near the entrance could have watched every movement around the tea service without appearing to stare. Inspector Mercer joined her. You've noticed something. The mirror. It seems ordinary enough. It is. She smiled gently. That is precisely why it interests me. He looked into the reflection. From that position, the tray remained visible even when guests gathered around it. No one would realize they were being observed. Quite. The inspector made a careful note. Later that afternoon, another piece of information emerged from the hospital. The Reverend Mallory had regained sufficient strength to answer several questions. Inspector Mercer visited him immediately. Do you remember the gathering? Yes, the tea. Only partly. Did anything unusual happen before you became ill? The Reverend closed his eyes, concentrating. I received a letter when, just before refreshments. From whom? I don't know. Did you open it? Not immediately. What became of it? I placed it inside my prayer book. Inspector Mercer searched the vicar's belongings that evening. Inside the worn leather prayer book lay a sealed envelope. It had never been opened. The handwriting on the front simply read, "For the Reverend Mallory, please read in private." There was no sender's name. The inspector carefully unfolded the single sheet inside. Its contents were brief. If you reveal what was told to you in confidence, another innocent life will be destroyed. Nothing more. Miss Marple read the anonymous message with thoughtful silence. It assumes the Reverend already knew something. Yes, said the inspector, and feared he might speak. She nodded, which means the motive may have existed long before the parish tea. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the growing pattern. The poison had not been administered in sudden anger or born from an impulsive quarrel during the gathering. Someone had arrived with a carefully prepared plan, believing the Reverend possessed knowledge dangerous enough to justify murder. Yet one detail continued to trouble her. If the anonymous writer had wished only to frighten the vicar into silence, the warning letter should have been sufficient. Choosing poison instead suggested that the writer already believed persuasion had failed. Somewhere before the fundraising tea, a conversation must have taken place that convinced the murderer the Reverend intended to act, despite every threat placed before him. The anonymous letter found inside the Reverend Mallory's prayer book shifted the investigation from opportunity to motive. Someone had not merely wished to frighten the vicar. They believed he possessed knowledge capable of ruining a carefully protected secret. Inspector Mercer began examining the Reverend's recent activities, searching for any conversation or event that might explain the warning. The church diary provided an unexpected clue. 3 evenings before the parish tea, the Reverend had visited the old cemetery after sunset. The entry mentioned no funeral or official duty, only a brief note in his own handwriting. Private meeting at the churchyard. The inspector frowned. No name. The church clerk shook his head. The Reverend often kept private appointments confidential. Did anyone see him that evening? After several inquiries, the sexton remembered locking the church gates later than usual. I noticed 2 people standing beside the oldest yew tree. Could you identify them? The Reverend was one, and the other. It was too dark. Were they arguing? No, they spoke quietly. The information raised more questions than it answered. Meanwhile, Miss Marple decided to visit the cemetery herself. She wandered slowly among the weathered gravestones until reaching the ancient yew tree described by the sexton. It overlooked the oldest section of the churchyard, where generations of village families rested beneath moss-covered stones. The ground nearby showed nothing remarkable. Yet Miss Marple noticed a small wooden bench positioned beneath the branches. From there, anyone seated could speak in complete privacy without being overheard from the church path. As she examined the area, the elderly gardener approached carrying fresh flowers. "You've come to see the old bench," she smiled. "Do many people use it?" "Only those who don't wish to be interrupted." He paused thoughtfully. "The Reverend often met villagers here when they wanted advice." "Recently?" "Last week." "Was he alone?" "No." "Do you know who accompanied him?" The gardener hesitated. "I believe it was Mr. Fletcher." Miss Marple thanked him without another question. That afternoon, Inspector Mercer invited Edwin Fletcher back to the station. "I understand you met the Reverend in the churchyard." Fletcher appeared surprised. "Who told you that?" "The gardener." He sighed quietly. "Very well. What did you discuss?" "A private matter." "Connected with church finances?" "No." "Then what?" Fletcher remained silent for several moments. Finally, he answered, "I confessed something." The inspector leaned forward. "What?" "I'd made an accounting mistake." "A mistake?" "Money had been placed in the wrong fund." "Was anything stolen?" "No." "Did the Reverend believe you?" "He said everyone deserves the chance to correct an honest error." Inspector Mercer studied him carefully. "Then why the anonymous warning?" "I've no idea." The explanation sounded sincere. Even so, it failed to explain why someone believed the Reverend possessed dangerous knowledge. Later that evening, Dr. Haydock informed the inspector that the vicar's memory had improved considerably. He remembers one additional detail. "What is it?" "The person he met beneath the yew tree wasn't frightened." "No, he was ashamed." Inspector Mercer repeated those words to Miss Marple. She considered them thoughtfully. "There is an important difference between shame and fear. Yes, a frightened person wishes to escape consequences, and an ashamed one, I wish they had never caused trouble at all." As darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple reflected upon the conversations surrounding the case. The churchyard meeting, the anonymous letter, and the poisoned tea no longer seemed like isolated events. They formed successive steps in a single plan. Someone had first confessed something to the Reverend in confidence. Later, another person discovered that conversation had taken place and became convinced the secret would eventually emerge. Yet, the confession itself might not have been the danger. The true threat could have been something the Reverend quietly deduced afterward, for Miss Marple had often observed that kind. Thoughtful people occasionally reached uncomfortable truths without anyone realizing they had done so, and once such a realization occurred, no warning, however desperate, could persuade them to pretend ignorance forever. The Reverend Mallory recovered enough strength by the following afternoon to speak privately with Inspector Mercer and Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple was invited to sit quietly in the corner of the hospital room, where she appeared occupied with her knitting while listening carefully to every word. The vicar looked pale but alert. "I remember the churchyard meeting now," he said softly. "You met Edwin Fletcher beneath the yew tree?" The inspector asked. "Yes." "What did he tell you?" "He confessed to an accounting error in the parish restoration fund." "Did he steal money?" "No." The Reverend shook his head weakly. He had transferred a payment to the wrong account and was ashamed of the confusion it caused. "Did you advise him to report it?" "I did." "Then why would someone poison your tea over such a mistake?" The Reverend closed his eyes briefly. "Because the accounting error led me to notice something else." Inspector Mercer leaned forward. "What?" The Restoration Fund records go on. When Edwin showed me the books, I realized one donation had been altered after it was entered. Altered how? The donor's name had been changed. From whom to whom? The Reverend hesitated. I cannot remember the original name, but you remembered it at the tea gathering. I believe so. Dr. Haydock intervened gently. Do not strain yourself. The vicar nodded gratefully. I only recall that the altered donation connected someone respectable to a matter they wished to forget. Inspector Mercer made a careful note. Did you discuss this with anyone besides Edwin Fletcher? No. Did Fletcher know you had noticed it? I don't think so. The inspector exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. If Fletcher had not known, then the poisoner must have been someone else connected to the altered record. Later that day, Mercer obtained the Parish Restoration Fund books from the church office. The entries appeared orderly at first glance, but one page showed signs of careful correction. An earlier donor's name had been erased and rewritten in darker ink. The visible name now read Mrs. Lydia Harper. Inspector Mercer frowned. Do we know the original entry? The church clerk examined the page under magnification. Only a few letters remain visible. Which letters? Har appears clear enough. Mercer looked thoughtful. That could still mean Harper. Yes, sir, but it might also mean another surname. Meanwhile, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Harper at her cottage. Lydia Harper welcomed her politely, though she seemed nervous when the Church Restoration Fund was mentioned. I did make a donation, she said quickly. I'm sure you did. It was for the roof repairs. How generous. Mrs. Harper relaxed slightly. The church means a great deal to me. Miss Marple smiled gently. It means a great deal to many people. She paused before adding, the Reverend was very grateful for all the support. Mrs. Harper's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Was he? Yes. Miss Marple watched her carefully. A truly innocent donor would likely have responded with simple pleasure. Mrs. Harper looked instead as though she were calculating something. Before leaving, Miss Marple noticed a framed photograph upon the mantelpiece. It showed Lydia Harper standing beside another woman at a church bazaar many years earlier. The second woman was Emily Carter's late mother. The resemblance was unmistakable. That evening, Miss Marple quietly mentioned the photograph to Inspector Mercer. The altered donation may not concern money alone, she said. What then? Relationships. Mercer looked puzzled. How so? If the original donor's name began with Har, we should not assume it referred to Mrs. Harper. You think it referred to Emily Carter's mother. I think we should discover whether Emily's mother had any connection to the Restoration Fund. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, the investigation seemed to widen unexpectedly. The poisoned tea, the churchyard confession, and the altered donation record were now connected, but not in the way Inspector Mercer had first imagined. Edwin Fletcher's accounting mistake might have revealed the altered entry, but the motive for murder appeared to belong elsewhere. Someone had feared that the Reverend Mallory would recognize the significance of the original donor's name, and that fear had been powerful enough to lead from quiet shame beneath a yew tree to poison in a teacup before the entire parish. Inspector Mercer wasted no time tracing the history of the Parish Restoration Fund. Old ledgers, donation receipts, and committee minutes were carried from dusty cupboards in the church office and spread across a long table. At first, they revealed nothing beyond years of ordinary generosity from the villagers. Then, buried inside a bundle of faded correspondence, the church clerk discovered an earlier copy of the donation list prepared before the final accounts had been rewritten. The inspector compared it with the official ledger. One name was different. The original entry did not belong to Lydia Harper. It belonged to Margaret Harding. The surname immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Margaret Harding had been Emily Carter's mother before her marriage. So the donation record really was altered, Inspector Mercer said quietly. But why? The church clerk looked genuinely puzzled. Mrs. Harding died nearly 15 years ago, which makes the alteration even stranger. There seemed little reason to change the name of someone long deceased, unless the original entry concealed something more important than a simple contribution. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Emily Carter. The young woman welcomed her warmly, though the strain of recent days remained evident upon her face. "I still cannot believe someone tried to kill the Reverend," Emily said softly. "It has been difficult for everyone." Miss Marple glanced toward an old wooden cabinet, standing beside the fireplace. "Your mother enjoyed keeping papers, I believe." Emily smiled faintly. "She never threw anything away. May I ask whether any of her old letters remain?" Emily opened the cabinet without hesitation. There are several boxes, most contained family photographs, birthday cards, and recipes carefully copied into small notebooks. At the bottom of the final box lay a folded envelope addressed simply to Margaret Harding. Inside was a receipt acknowledging a generous anonymous donation made to the Church Restoration Fund many years earlier. The amount matched the altered ledger entry exactly. Miss Marple read the receipt twice. "There is no donor's name." "No," Emily replied. "My mother said someone wished to remain anonymous." "Did she ever explain why?" Emily shook her head. "She promised never to reveal it." Miss Marple thanked her and carefully returned the document. The receipt itself proved very little, yet it established one important fact. Margaret Harding had recorded the donation honestly. Someone else had altered the church records afterward. That evening, Inspector Mercer questioned Lydia Harper once again. She admitted knowing Margaret Harding well. "We organized church events together for years." "Did she ever mention the anonymous donation?" "Never." "Did you alter the ledger?" "Certainly not." Her denial came quickly, though not indignantly. Miss Marple quietly observed the exchange from the corner of the room. She noticed that Lydia answered every direct question without hesitation. Only when Margaret Harding's name was mentioned did she briefly lower her eyes. After the interview ended, Inspector Mercer sighed. "We're still missing something." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "The alteration itself." He looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The handwriting. It belongs to the church clerk." "Exactly. The clerk rewrote the ledger after the committee approved the final accounts." Miss Marple smiled gently, "which means the person responsible never touched the book." Mercer considered the implication. The false name must have been supplied before the final copy was written. Precisely. As they left the church office, Miss Marple found herself thinking less about documents than about human nature. Ledgers did not change themselves. Someone had persuaded another person that the revised name was correct, and such persuasion required trust rather than deception alone. The poisoner had been planning carefully long before the parish tea, quietly reshaping small facts until they became accepted truth. Now, with the Reverend recovering and forgotten records resurfacing, that carefully constructed story was beginning to unravel. Somewhere among the respectable faces of St. Mary Mead stood the one person who knew exactly why Margaret Harding's name had to disappear, and Miss Marple suspected that person was growing more desperate with every passing day. As the investigation entered its final days, Inspector Mercer noticed a subtle but important change in the behavior of those connected with the case. People who had previously spoken freely now measured every sentence. Casual conversations ended when an officer entered the room, and even innocent questions were answered with unusual care. The pressure of the inquiry was beginning to affect everyone. Miss Marple believed that such moments often revealed more than formal interviews ever could. At her suggestion, Inspector Mercer invited the principal witnesses to the church hall once again. Officially, the gathering was intended to clarify a few remaining details about the afternoon of the poisoning. In reality, Miss Marple wished to observe how each person reacted when confronted with the same familiar surroundings. The refreshment table had been arranged exactly as it had been on the day of the parish tea. Empty cups stood neatly beside the silver teapot, while the flower arrangement occupied its original position near the stage. One by one, the guests repeated their movements. Mrs. Finch demonstrated how she had poured the Reverend's first cup. Emily Carter explained where she had stood while arranging lemon slices. Edwin Fletcher described his conversation near the entrance. Lydia Harper quietly recalled speaking with several ladies beside the window. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Miss Marple's attention rested elsewhere. She noticed that whenever anyone approached the refreshment table, Lydia Harper's eyes followed the silver sugar bowl rather than the teapot. The habit seemed unconscious. Inspector Mercer observed it as well. Later, after the reconstruction had ended, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the serving table. She lifted the sugar bowl carefully. "It is rather heavier than I expected." Mrs. Finch smiled. "It has a double base. A double base. For storing extra sugar cubes during larger gatherings." Miss Marple gently examined the bowl. The hidden compartment was empty. Even so, she remained thoughtful. Inspector Mercer joined her. "You found something?" "Not yet." She replaced the lid. "But I believe someone else already has." That afternoon, the inspector ordered the silver bowl examined. Hidden beneath a thin, removable lining, the laboratory discovered tiny traces of the same poison found in the Reverend's teacup. The poison had not been mixed with the sugar. Instead, the concealed compartment had apparently been used to transport a small vial. Someone had removed it before the police secured the church hall. The discovery explained why the murderer had returned to hide the missing cup. There had been another object to recover. Inspector Mercer immediately questioned every volunteer who had remained inside the hall after the Reverend collapsed. Only 4 people had done so: Mrs. Finch, Emily Carter, Edwin Fletcher, Lydia Harper. That evening, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Lydia Harper. The older woman appeared tired. "I've answered every question." "I know. Then why am I here?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I wished only to ask about Margaret Harding." Lydia's hands tightened around her handbag. "She was my dearest friend." "I'm sure she was. She trusted me completely, and you valued that trust." A long silence followed. Finally, Lydia spoke. "She asked me to keep a promise." "What promise?" "Never to reveal the identity of the anonymous donor." "Did you keep it?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "I believe you did." Lydia looked up in surprise. "You believe me?" "I do." Relief briefly crossed her face. "But," Miss Marple continued softly, "keeping that promise and altering the church records are 2 very different matters." Lydia's expression changed at once. She said nothing. She did not deny it. She merely stared toward the window as though seeing something far beyond the village rooftops. When Inspector Mercer later asked what had happened, Miss Marple answered quietly, "Mrs. Harper is protecting someone." "You've known that for some time." "Yes, but she is not protecting herself." The inspector considered her words carefully. If Lydia Harper had altered the records to shield another person, then the attempted murder could not have been motivated by money alone. Someone else had persuaded her that changing a single name would preserve an important secret. Now, with the hidden compartment discovered and the Reverend steadily recovering, that unseen individual had almost exhausted every opportunity to conceal the truth. Miss Marple suspected the final piece of the puzzle was no longer hidden in ledgers or letters. It lay within a single conversation that someone feared more than any document the police had yet uncovered. The following afternoon, Inspector Mercer gathered the principal witnesses inside the church hall for one final meeting. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows exactly as it had on the day of the parish tea. But the cheerful atmosphere had long since vanished. Every face reflected the strain of waiting for an answer. Miss Marple sat quietly near the front, her knitting resting untouched upon her lap. Inspector Mercer addressed the room. "The poison was carried into this hall inside the hidden compartment of the silver sugar bowl. Whoever placed it there believed the Reverend Mallory had discovered a secret that could no longer remain hidden." No one spoke. Miss Marple rose gently. "The secret did not concern money," she said, "nor did it begin with the altered church accounts. Those records merely concealed the identity of an anonymous donor." She looked toward Lydia Harper. "Mrs. Harper kept a promise made to her dear friend Margaret Harding. She altered the final ledger because she believed she was protecting her confidence." Lydia lowered her head. "I never imagined anyone would be harmed." "I know." The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "Margaret begged me never to reveal the donor's name." Inspector Mercer stepped forward. "Who was the donor?" Lydia hesitated only briefly. the Reverend himself. A murmur spread through the room. The Reverend secretly donated the money years ago, Lydia continued. He feared public recognition would embarrass the parish and asked Margaret to record it privately. After Margaret died, I believed that promise still bound me. Miss Marple nodded. An honourable mistake. Inspector Mercer frowned. That still does not explain the poisoning. No, Miss Marple replied softly. Because the donation itself was never the danger. She turned toward Edwin Fletcher. When Mr. Fletcher discovered the altered record, he innocently confessed the accounting error to the Reverend. During that conversation, the Reverend realized someone had recently examined the old ledger. Edwin looked bewildered. I only wanted to correct my mistake, and in doing so, Miss Marple said kindly, you unknowingly revealed that another person had been searching the church records. Her eyes slowly settled upon Emily Carter. The young woman's face became pale. No, Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Your late mother kept every receipt and every letter. You knew she had preserved the original record showing the Reverend's anonymous gift. Emily's hands trembled. I only wanted to protect Mother's memory. You feared people would believe she had accepted money dishonestly. Emily closed her eyes. When I found someone had altered the ledger years ago, I panicked. Then the Reverend began asking questions after Edwin's confession. I thought he would accuse Mother of changing the records herself. So you sent the anonymous warning. A tear rolled down Emily's cheek. Yes. And when he refused to remain silent, I placed the poison in his cup. Her voice broke completely. I never meant to kill him. I only wanted to stop him from speaking until I could explain everything. Inspector Mercer stepped forward quietly. You returned to hide the second cup and recover the poison vial. Emily nodded without resistance. I thought if the police found it, they would discover everything. As the inspector gently placed her under arrest, the church hall remained silent. There was no anger, only sadness at how fear had transformed a kind-hearted young woman into someone capable of attempted murder. Several weeks later, the Reverend Mallory returned to the pulpit, still weaker than before, but grateful to be alive. During his first Sunday sermon, he spoke not of crime or punishment, but of truth, forgiveness, and the heavy burden carried by secrets left untold. After the service, Mrs. Bantry asked Miss Marple whether the tragedy could have been avoided. Miss Marple smiled sadly. Very often, she replied, people believe they are protecting those they love by hiding the truth. Yet, fear has a curious way of growing larger in darkness. Had everyone trusted honesty a little sooner, no poisoned cup would ever have been placed upon that table. She resumed her knitting as the church bells rang across St. Mary Mead, where peace gradually returned, not because every sorrow had been forgotten, but because the truth, however painful, had finally been allowed into the light.